How do you design the question to ensure it provides an opportunity for authentic assessment?
Okay, so the module I'm going to talk to you about is called Organisational Development, and the main purpose of that module is to teach the students how to use soft systems methodology. So that's a way of examining a problematic situation in order to head towards a solution, but we're trying to stop the students from solutioneering. What we want them to do is to explore the problem in full using this specific methodology. So what we have to give them a real life situation to examine, because if you try and do it theoretically, it's such a practical methodology that if you do it theoretically, it just is meaningless and it's dull and incomprehensible and strange. Whereas if they do it in practice with real people, with a real problematic situation, and I should pause there and say, I use problematic very carefully, because any situation where it could be made up of a whole range of problems, and the thing to do is not to say, oh look, we've got one problem and here's the solution. The thing to do is to understand all of it. So we give them a real life situation to examine with real people. And of course that in itself gives us the authentic assessment, because they're taking theory and methodology, they're exploring this situation, applying the theory, learning the methodology as they go, but also then problem solving. So it's real action learning to come out with a solution. And then, so the whole process is authentic because it's real. And then at the end of that, we ask them to write up what they've done, almost as you would write up an experiment, and that's so that we can check that they've understood the methodology and the theory behind it, but also then moving into their findings and what that means and reflecting on the process. So the whole thing is based around that real life situation. We feed theory into it and they apply the theory.
Why did you choose to use a portfolio solution?
Well, if I go back to how we did it in the past, when we get the students to look at this problematic situation, we obviously put them into teams to do that. So we want small numbers looking at the situations. So we give them breakout rooms to do that. So they have to have the facilities in their PCs, whiteboards and all of that. And those breakout rooms are inevitably spread all over the campus. So what happened was we ended up walking miles between each syndicate group, which would take ages, and it would often mean that we didn't get to all of them in a day, and so they were feeling isolated and working alone. And it also meant that the people who were involved in the problematic situation, the stakeholders, weren't able to participate and give their feedback. And the whole point of the methodology is that you're constantly feeding back your findings and having discussion with the people who are involved in the situation in order to improve their understanding and improve your learning about it. So we came up with this year and used it for the first time, and it was so much better. It meant that, I mean, we didn't not go out to them in the syndicate rooms, we still did that, but it meant that we could spend time also online. We could give them feedback pretty much live, actually, as they were doing things. We could give them commentary on it, but we could look back over stuff that they've done, we could comment on it. The stakeholders could look in and they could comment on it and participate in what we were doing. Obviously better sharing for the students as well, and at any point they didn't have to be in the syndicate rooms, they could be anywhere and they could engage with what they were doing and add information to it. We got really positive feedback from the students. They'd moaned bitterly about the preparation side, having to learn how to use yet another new system. They have to use these similar sharing systems at work and they don't like them, but actually they really enjoyed it and they could see the point of it. They found it very easy to use, very user-friendly. There was a lot of personalisation of pages that went on, so they obviously enjoyed that side of it as well. But yeah, they really took to it. So I think it was a massive benefit, both to us as teaching staff trying to engage with a number of syndicate groups, but also for them in terms of their working and learning.
Have you come across any plagiarism while marking? And if so, what type?
No, and I think the kind of assessment that we're using really doesn't lend itself to plagiarism, because you're having to, it's a very unique and specific problematic situation that they're given for a start. They're having to relate what they did and what they found and how it worked in that situation. They're asked to draw on theory. I don't know, I suppose you could plagiarise somebody's theory and not acknowledge it, but we're asking them to say, what's the theory around this? How does it apply in this situation? And then reflect on that. So, no to plagiarism. Obviously, occasions of bad referencing, which is a different thing. I think that's more down to them not understanding how to reference rather than trying to plagiarise. So I would say it's a great way of trying to drive that out, because they really have to use the information in a real way.
Would you consider using portfolio for other modules assessment, or recommend more authentic assessment to colleagues? If so, why?
Definitely use of the portfolio, particularly if you're doing group work. Or if you have stakeholders that you want to engage. I think it works very well for those instances. I think definitely again for the authentic assessment, because they get a lot out of the real life situations, and being able to understand how you apply that theory and where it works and where it doesn't work, being able to engage with real people. You practice a huge amount of skills when you're working with real people that feed into the dissertation process and how they do research. You know, they have to interview people, they have to gather that information and they have to analyse it, for example. But there's all sorts of things that they do, really good learning for the future as they progress through the course. The other thing about authentic assessment is that I think it really forces you as a teacher to have to think very clearly about what you're doing with that assessment and why you're doing it. And you have to manage the students' expectations around that. Why are you doing this? Is it just that you're giving the university a bit of free consultancy? Because, you know, the more cynical amongst them will think of it like that. But thinking through, what are we going to do? What do they need to have beforehand in terms of skills and knowledge? What are they going to utilise as they go through the process? What is the end product going to look like? And how do we feed that into that final summative assessment? So I think it forces you to think about your educational processes and what you're doing as a teacher. So I'd really recommend anybody to think about using an authentic approach.